Welcome to Human Solutions, simplifying HR for people who love HR from AIM HR Solutions. I'm Pete Wright, and this week we're taking on one of the messiest corners of HR, the moment that an employee walks in and says, I need something different because of a medical issue. If you've ever felt that little jolt of, I want to do right by this person right now, followed immediately by, oh no, how could I possibly mess this up? You are in exactly the right place. Joined by our very own resident expert, AIM HR's Terry Cook, who is ready to break down what HR should be doing in these moments, what to ask for, what's required, what's optional, and how to stay on the right side of both compassion and compliance. We're talking clarity, confidence, and the real-world decisions HR has to make every single day. Terry Cook, these are hard questions, and I don't think they're getting any easier given the Pete gestures broadly situation that we have in the world right now. We're going to start with a question that comes in, and I've got some, I'll tell you, I noodled on these, so I've got some sub-questions. Sub-questions, part A, stroke 1. Get ready.
Okay. All right.
An employee
Ready.
asks for a job or schedule change due to medical needs. Can you walk us through the right process here?
Sure. So when an employee comes in and asks about it, I think one thing that some people don't realize is they don't have to say, I needed an accommodation, or they don't have to use the word disability. They can do exactly what you said, Pete, just mentioning that there is a need for some kind of a change in the job. And it's important that you react quickly. As you mentioned, compassionately, but listening. So talking to the employee first and foremost, talking about, sounds like you might be asking about an accommodation. This is when it's really important that HR people have job descriptions ready. And those job descriptions should include medical requirements as well. And when you do have all of those things, you can just let the employee know, sounds like you might need an accommodation. We'd love to give you your job description. If you could just have your doctor let us know what you might need for an accommodation, we'd love to review that for you. So just keeping the interactive process started and open is important. And it's not about some people will say, well, if the employee says they need this, I'm giving them that. That's not the absolute requirement. You need to start the process and start it right with your job descriptions in place.
How do you balance keeping the tone supportive, compassionate, but also being super clear about policy? Because I think there are some very easy human questions that we tend to ask when we're just talking person to person, friend to friend,
Right.
colleague to colleague, that we probably shouldn't say when
Sure.
we're in a conversation in the HR office. Walk
Absolutely.
us through that tightrope.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about just keeping things as far as open to the listening to the employee, but making sure you're not asking for extensive medical information, making sure you're not asking them for a diagnosis. That's all protected information under HIPAA. So it's really about just getting the information that's required for you to make a decision on what you can and can't accommodate.
So there's no hey, we're off the record now in HR.
No.
Right.
No,
there's
not
we're off the
really.
record.
I
What's
mean, that
going on with
happens.
you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people certainly do share things with human resources.
Yeah.
They don't have to. And if the HR person's not asking those questions, usually you just steer that conversation back to saying, we won't need any of that detailed information of your diagnosis. We really just need to know what you can and can't do safely. So what accommodations you might require. And we'd love to look that over and then sit with you and talk to you about it more. So keeping it open, like I said, Pete, will people share? Sure. There's a lot of
Okay.
employees that share a lot of information with us, but I typically will tell people to kind of steer it back to the main focus, which is really just trying to have the conversation about what they might need from us.
Thrilled I am that you walked headlong into my next question.
Oh, I just love doing that for you.
This is what we call podcast entrapment. All right.
Uh-oh.
Somebody comes
Fabulous.
to you and says, I'm dealing with this issue. And in the course of conversation, they tell you exactly what's going on with them.
Sure.
Is there a situation in which you now have information that would change what you would do for this employee if you didn't have this information. Does that make any sense?
I'm trying to follow you, Pete.
Okay.
So you give me a little bit more on that.
Well, the problem is I don't know what it would be, but I what I'm trying to get to is you are now armed with specific information, diagnostic information about what this employee is living with, right?
Yes.
And knowing that information might change the way you view the employee's relationship with the company, because you're in this dual role. You're compassionate about the team. You're also supporting and protecting the organization. How do you balance that, knowing that this is something that normally you would never have asked for and would never have otherwise known, but the employee was forthright?
Right. And that does happen. Like we were saying before, people do tend to share more with human resources because you're usually close to the employees, you're checking up on them, you're visiting with them, even when there isn't a problem. So it's always important for us in HR that we just have to stay objective, look at the facts, and try to move forward with the facts. That being said, can you have compassion for somebody? If somebody breaks down in your office, that certainly has happened. Somebody finds out some type of a diagnosis that's really upsetting to them, maybe cancer or something like that. And they may feel comfortable enough with the human resources person to just break it down and just say it. And they just really need somebody to listen. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, you do have compassion. You do want to help the person. So whether they're asking for an accommodation or not, I guess to me is kind of irrelevant. It's just about being a person, listening to a person, and then also moving forward into the next steps as far as what they need. And how can they get there? And what's the best way for us as a company to get all of the information we need to help them? Because that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. What is the general, you say act quickly. What's a realistic timeline for getting everything you need? Sometimes it's hard dealing with medical offices and such and so.
I think when it's react quickly, what I'm referring to is the HR person reacts quickly. So as soon as Pete comes in to see Terry and says, I need an accommodation, Terry doesn't wait 2 days and 3 days to get back and meet with Pete and talk about what the next steps are. The HR person needs to react right away and say, okay, Pete, let's talk about this a little bit. And let me tell you what our policy and practice is around accommodations and what the next steps are. So it's about us acting quickly. You're 100% right. You don't know when the doctor might respond because they're busy. So you just have to wait and see what you're receiving from the doctor. And just, again, the interactive dialogue and the interactive process is key. You have to always be talking to the employee, making sure you're protecting the employee and the company. So as an example, if somebody says as an employee to their supervisor, I'm not safe because I need accommodations, you're not going to continue to have the person do something that's making them unsafe. It doesn't help them, and it doesn't help you. It doesn't help the company. So what you do is try to take an appropriate midterm action if you have to, and remind that employee, you have the job description, you have, information. Could you just please follow up with your doctor? We really want to make sure you're able to. Sometimes that results in an employee saying, you know what, I don't feel comfortable coming to work until I get that information. Okay. And you just work with the employee until you get more information from the doctor.
On the other side of that, you have the situation where an employee comes to you and says, my doctor says I need an accommodation because of a situation that I'm dealing with.
Sure.
And over the course of this discussion, or maybe even after the accommodation is made, the employee comes to disagree with the doctor's recommendation and begins acting in a way that they don't need their accommodation anymore. They disagree with doctor recommendations, and now you're in the middle of it.
That's right.
Where do you stand?
Anytime we have a notification in hand, we've provided an accommodation. If the employee starts doing something like you're saying against that, you're immediately going to approach the employee. The supervisor or manager will send them back to human resources to talk to them. And my conversation with them would be quite simple. We have a notification from your doctor that you submitted saying that you can only do X, Y, and Z. Your supervisor or manager is telling me that you're now doing
B,
D, E, and F.
G, L. Yeah.
Right. So, we need to further this conversation. If you're saying you no longer need this accommodation, give us some follow-up information about that. Or maybe your accommodation needs have changed. That's okay. We just as a company want to make sure we have all the right information on file for what you need and making sure you're safe here. Safety is number one. So we want to make sure you're safe. And the example I used before, if this same employee was the one that said, Terry, I don't feel safe here. And, and now they're suddenly doing things against the accommodation that they presented to me. Yeah, I would have a concern because I would remind them, you told me before you weren't feeling safe. We're now practicing what you've asked us for. Your supervisor's telling me you're doing something different. We need to get an update here.
Okay. Well, this leads right into our next major difficult accommodation question.
Okay.
When is it okay for you to deny an accommodation request? How do we define undue hardship, really?
Yeah. So undue hardship it depends on the nature of the business. Sometimes it's the cost of the accommodation, and the cost also goes into the size of the business, the profitability or operation costs. It can go into the number of employees. So maybe there's one person doing a job, maybe there's 20 people doing a job. So anything that can impact the overall operations or efficiency or safety, you can look at that. That all being said, people need to be very, very careful because the ADA will really look to the employer to defend why they think there's an undue hardship here. They're not going, they use a very narrow scope to look at what they could define as undue hardship and would pass through versus what a company may think is undue hardship. Somebody might, maybe a company that's a nonprofit or not making any money sees a request for $1,000 ergonomic chair. That may be for them something they want to prove as an undue hardship, but a company that's making millions of dollars, they're not going to be able to argue the $1,000 chair is an undue hardship. So everything will get looked at. Like if you have a small company and they say you need to install an elevator, an elevator may not be a financial thing there. But now if you have a small company and somebody says you need to put a ramp on your stairway, a ramp is not an undue hardship usually because it's not an expensive item. And it's not always items. Sometimes it's hours, right? They might need reduction in hours. They might need to work remotely or hybrid. There's a lot of pieces, but the companies just really have to be prepared to look at the nature and cost, the impact on operations, the size of their company, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that becomes a bigger question once you expand it out to context and size of company, right? I hadn't been considering that, right? If you're a massive major corporation, that chair is trivial.
Yes.
But if you've got 7 employees and everybody's working on stools, and suddenly you need $1,000 chair, that's very different. So
it might be
the other elements, right? Safety, cost, disruption. Inability to perform essential functions, like all of these issues fall into, undue hardship that we have to consider. Are there others that I mentioned that we don't, that we need to make sure we check off the list? Other reasons an accommodation fails the test?
I think it can be because of maybe the nature of an operation. So somebody has to be there to open up a business. They're the ones with the keys. No one else has the keys. No one else can do that person's job. That might be something. It might be, customer service kind of situation. It's really got to be viewed very carefully. I know, we have gotten helpline calls where ever since COVID, some people just did not want to come back to the office. They were able to work remotely potentially for a while. They don't want to come back to the office and they come through with these notifications. Again, it's a process. It's a process of saying, could this person legitimately do their job remotely? And if so, that's one thing. Or was it a situation where that person's job got reduced by 50 or 60%? They're only doing like 40% of their job at home because that's all they can do. Now they want to work full time at home still. A company's going to be able to define that a little clearer to say, this is why this person can't do 60% of their job if they're working all remotely. But hey, let's have the interactive discussion. How would hybrid work for you? Maybe we can have you do a few days at home and maybe, so I mean, again, it's all about that discussion and good faith that you're all acting together. Sometimes it's also about maybe somebody's job has changed since they started with you. And they're asking for an accommodation because these added responsibilities impact something. So you have to look at that too, because that wasn't their job before. So when they're asking for something different, there might be a good reason for it. It's a
Sure.
conversation. I do think some employers get nervous when somebody asks for something and they just automatically do it and say, "Well, Pete asked me. I'm going to go ahead and do it." Could they go ahead and do it because they're being nicer? They're not doing anything against the law. They're not saying they're not
Sure.
doing things. They could do that. But then there's other people that say, no matter what they ask, no. The answer is no. That's probably
Well,
not going to work for them in the long run.
sure. I mean, the risk of setting precedent seems
Mhm.
to be
For sure.
another related challenge. Do
Right.
you ever run into a situation where you have to ask yourself what isn't undue hardship, even if managers, line managers, team managers wish it were?
They wish it were. Yeah, I mean, there's tough conversations with supervisors or managers because obviously they have a big responsibility in their department. They want it to operate the way they've always operated it. We find a change that might be slight in nature that they have to accommodate. It might not be natural for them to think they should accommodate that because they're used to doing things this way.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. There's definitely times where a manager or supervisor might disagree with human resources or the company's decision to say, absolutely, we can accommodate this. This is not a problem. And it's
Yeah.
really about training and educating your managers and supervisors. In those scenarios, it's also pretty common for them to say, I want to know what's wrong with Pete. You tell me why Pete
Man,
can't
if
do
I had a
this.
dime
Yeah,
for
right,
every time
right.
somebody asked that question.
Absolutely. That's not okay.
Yeah.
We're not sharing medical information with you. That's not your concern. We've made the decision. We have the information. The medical information is of no concern to you. And there's the training, right? Because that supervisor still might go up to Pete and say, I want to know what you're doing. Why do I have to let you do X?
Mhm.
Um, so HR has to stay really in touch with people, but it's very common, for people to just say, if I have to deal with this, you need to tell me why.
What documentation does HR need to justify a denial? Is this the kind of thing where you want to make sure you let legal counsel know before you're denying something? How protective do you need to be?
Again, because of the fact that it's a narrow scope, you want to be very careful on when you're denying things. Do I think it's a good idea to potentially talk to legal counsel? Sure. If you have any question in your mind that this could come back at you, I would 100% say talk to your legal counsel before you do it. They're going to have a better idea of how the court might rule in favor of something and something else. The other thing to keep in mind is the ADA is a very broad definition of what can
Sure.
impact a major life activity. So companies need to be aware of that because they have to watch that because they can't just say, oh, I don't think that's true. That's not a disability. So it's got to be something carefully thought through. And again, if you really feel strongly that you have a case, you may want to talk to your legal counsel so that you're not in court.
Okay. All right. Next major question. How
Sure.
does HR support an employee's accommodation request while maintaining fairness and consistency for everyone else?
It's the trickiest part, right?
Yeah, right?
It is. It's very tricky. It's one of those things that the company has to do what they know they need to do based on the accommodation request. They don't owe the explanation to the other employees, which is always tricky because they're going to say, well, why can Pete work from home 2 days and I can't?
Yeah.
So usually, one of the ways I speak to people is I say to them, it's like any scenario, the company is acting according to their policy and practice. You can be assured of that. Just as I wouldn't share information about you with that person you're asking about, I can't share information about that person with you because it goes both ways. We don't want to share information that's personal to that employee with anybody else. It's just, it's just one of those things that you just can't, once you start saying anything, there's going to be a rabbit hole and they're going to keep having 100 other questions to ask. And if you just have to keep it simple, as yourself, as a company, as HR, you're doing the right thing because you had the interactive process. Does it mean that the employees might not be happy? Could be, but employee morale is not an undue hardship. So companies need to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
It's just
Right.
not. And there are
Yeah.
companies that honestly would think it is because they're like,
Yeah.
okay, now I'm going to irritate 20 people because
Yeah.
of one, and they say, well, that's an undue hardship. That's not going to be looked at. Just if it's morale alone, it wouldn't be looked at as an undue hardship by the court, likely.
Well, you're getting to kind of the squishy underbelly of this issue, right? Where,
Hmm.
as an HR representative, you're about to make this decision. You want to kind of be aware what's around that next corner where I may unintentionally create inequity
Mm.
by, following through with this request for accommodation. I,
Hmm.
I mean, it seems like maybe a silly question, but is that a
No,
thing you think about?
I think you always think about it, and that's why it's important to follow the full process and get the accommodation request and the information from the provider of some sort, not from just an employee telling you. Because
Yeah,
any employee could come in and say, "I want this." You say, "Okay." If you have no documentation and no process in place, how are to your point, Pete, you're setting a precedent. How are you going to say no to Terry when she asks if you let Pete
yeah,
do it and there's no reason behind it? So that's why it's critical that they have a process in place to address anybody that comes in and asks for an accommodation.
right. It'd be great if we could get the whole team $1,000 chairs. And
Yes,
that
sure. We
that
would.
may answer our accommodation
It
and
might.
our inequity.
Yeah, it may. I've
What
had it
are
happen though with chairs. To be honest with you, with
with
the
chairs?
chairs, yeah, I know. Yeah, you
Don't
probably
mess
knew
with
that was
chairs.
coming. Don't mess with chairs. People like the nice chairs. If you don't
Yeah,
have everybody have a nice chair, and as a company, we determined that when that person requested the chair, we were in a financial, position where we could provide those chairs to others, and we just went ahead and did that to
yeah,
try to avoid the discussion because we had a couple people say, "Man, she's got a nice chair. He's got a great chair. Why am I sitting in this thing?" And
yeah,
what do I have to do to get a chair? We were thinking to ourselves, this is a nominal cost for something that can be fixed that quickly, and it did impact people's thoughts in the departments. And so
yeah.
we went ahead and just gave the chairs to people and then
But
went forward. Not everybody can, but we did. And
well,
this was at a previous company.
in
Yeah.
the immortal words of The Incredibles, when every chair is special, no chair is special.
Yeah. Good point, Pete. Yeah.
Uh,
Good point.
it's not a good point, Terry.
Sure
Thank you for
it is,
saying that.
Pete. I
Well, give me
appreciate your
give me a
references.
sense of the most common ADA accommodation mistakes we should be on the lookout for.
I think the response time, we already talked
Okay.
about that.
Yep, we got that.
That's one big thing. The other big thing is people waiting to hear a special word. I
Okay.
need an accommodation. I have a disability. They don't have to use special words. They expect a company to understand that. Not having job descriptions, especially ones that might be thorough enough.
If
Another
if
one.
people don't know that Get Your Job Description is an anthem of this show by now,
I know,
please
right?
please get your job descriptions in order.
I know. And just process, right? Your policy and
Okay.
your process. You just knowing that and knowing your interactive process, knowing how who's going to be doing what. And then I guess the one other thing I would mention that we've already talked about is making sure your managers and supervisors are trained so that they know not to say to what you said earlier,
Yeah.
but also like what should they do? They should send the person to HR. But if they don't know that, for example, then that's going to be a problem.
Well, and this gets to our last major question, which I think is
Sure.
intimately related. How does
Sure.
HR address situations when an employee receives modified or alternative work for medical reasons and other employees believe it's preferential treatment? So I know
Yeah.
there is a response that
Sure.
we have to this question, but as sort of sub point A, there
Sure.
is also an obligation by HR to train up managers on how to coach adaptability, how to coach resilience, how to coach,
Mhm.
this is how we deal with interruption. How do
Mhm.
you deal with this last big one?
I mean, I think you said it wonderfully in the sense it's teaching them, training them, but coaching is a big piece, right? If they
Yeah,
don't know how to address it, their gut reaction may be to say the wrong thing and bring us all down the wrong path. But
right.
if they know how to coach and have conversations and do that with their employees the right way, I think it makes all the difference in the world because the employees are going to respond. So if I came to you and said, "Pete, I don't know. I think Sarah over there is getting some different treatment or so is Joey," and you were like, you could be right. I mean,
Hmm.
you're not going to want your manager and supervisor to respond that way. You're going to want to say, we treat everybody the same. We try to make sure that everybody is treated appropriately. If you have questions, about our process or our policy, please go see human resources.
That's so interesting because now you're in a position where not only do you maintain confidentiality about the employee's situation, but
Hmm.
also you run into this line between where you have to understand that the team may resent you because they don't understand the
I
accommodation
know.
itself.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
so there's a line between explaining the process versus explaining an individual situation that landed us there.
that's right. Yeah, and all you can do is let them know that, you as a company have, your processes and policies, and you have to protect personal information of each employee.
Yeah.
And again, using the example that I said earlier, when I say to somebody, "You wouldn't want me telling Pete about what's going on with you." I can't tell you what's going on with Pete. Usually, as simple as that sounds, it tends to make them think to say, "Oh yeah, I guess I wouldn't want anybody knowing what I'm doing, but now here I am asking that question." Now, does that work for everybody? Of course not. You're still going to get
Yeah.
people that say, "Well, I don't care. You can tell anybody anything about me,"
Yeah. Right.
because I want to know what's going on with him,
Yeah.
So, and you just have to tell them there's laws, there's things that protect people's personal information that you cannot share in the workplace, and that's why we have policies and processes in place. But
Well,
it's tough. It's not easy.
no.
No. Mm.
As much as I love learning from questions where,
Hmm.
because, and I say this not from any sort of delight in Schadenfreude, right? That I like learning from companies whose best intentions lead down a road of poor decisions
Okay.
unintentionally.
Sure.
But there
Yeah.
is also, who do you put on a shining hill? Can you think of an example of an organization that just nails it? That gets this right every time? What do you look at as aspirational policy and training and approach to these sorts of medical accommodations decisions?
Sure. I think you're highlighting it in your question. I think it's about a company having a process, a policy, a direction that they're sharing openly. There's open communication, especially starting with the managers and supervisors, so that they understand it's not we're just going to take care of it. You're not involved. It's a here's the process. Here's what's legal. Here's what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And then they understand. And this is what you can and can't say. A lot of times, supervisors and managers are okay as long as you tell them what they can and can't say. If
Yeah.
they're put in a situation where they feel awkward because they have no idea what to do, they're going to stumble more. So it's our job to educate them and tell them what's why. You give them the why behind it, and often when you do that, people will respond better because they know what the why is, and the why is important because they need to know what to do and when to do it. And I think that's important. So I think you've already touched on all of it in your question. Teaching somebody how to respond, telling them why you have to respond that way, telling them what the company's going to do to protect the employees and the company. I think all of those are critical.
I think anybody who's a manager, I think, probably relates to the experience of being trained in the middle of a
Mhm.
crisis or a
Yes,
perceived crisis,
you're right.
that it doesn't feel
Absolutely.
good. But
It
if you're
doesn't.
trained when there isn't a crisis and you have time
Yeah.
to internalize and adapt yourself,
And ask
you'll,
questions.
yeah, you'll
Yeah.
perform much better
That's a great
than,
point. Yeah, if you
yeah,
wanna train people and do things right up front, it will protect them down the road, and like you said, I'm a big believer in letting people ask questions. I'd rather them ask me a question and let me explain things to them than
yeah,
for them to walk away upset or confused, because then they're going to take that with them into their department.
of course, of course.
Yeah.
Terry, as always, thank you for your time. I so
No problem.
enjoy these conversations and
Me
learn so,
too.
so much. For
Good.
everybody who's listening, thank you for hanging out with us today. We sure appreciate you joining us for lunch. Hopefully, you've dined well. Don't
Yeah.
forget, if you want to get your questions on an upcoming session, please, 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 AIM members can reach out to the HR helpline. I'll give you the number, 800-470-6277. That's 800-470-6277. Or send us an email, helpline@aimnet.org. And we will, Terry or somebody also very, very smart will respond. You may even
Yeah.
talk to TikTok Tom.
You
on
might talk
behalf.
to him.
You might talk
Before
to
you
him.
go, Tom,
Yeah.
before you go, Pete, there is a really helpful website. It's called the Job Accommodation Network. I believe it's called Ask Jan, and that's
AskJan.org.
yes, it's a really nice, has a nice toolkit on there for looking at accommodations. Certainly, somebody could go through a whole ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act class that we offer. But if you're looking at looking for toolkits, ideas, I often find that helpful. So just want to throw that out there.
I will put that link in the episode notes. Also, the EEOC publication on your responsibilities as an employer will be in there. And, of course, ADA.gov and any of the wonderful trainings that are offered by AIM HR Solutions. On behalf of Terry Cook, I'm Pete Wright. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month right here on Human Solutions.